This occurred a long time ago. Camping has never appealed to me. I simply wasn't made for it. The bugs, the dirt, and the terrible sleeping bag nights that, for some reason, always feel like rocks in the morning. Though never voluntarily, I regrettably have gone camping more times than I can remember. My father is one of those tough, nature-loving people. And to get away from technology and get back in touch with nature, Dad would take me into the woods every summer when I was a child with his equally tough pals. I was tired of pain and silence by the time I started my sophomore year of high school. In order to make the situation a little more tolerable, I eventually persuaded him to allow me to bring a buddy. I was shocked when he accepted without any fuss. I thus brought Charles, a friend from school. Now, given that Charles was a former Boy Scout and genuinely enjoys camping, you would assume that having him there would have made things worse. Charles, however, was cool with it. He made fun of me for detesting it, but he wasn't one of those people who said that if you don't enjoy the outdoors, you're not a true man. Furthermore, I reasoned that if I had to endure hardship, at least it would be with someone who could set up a tent and build a fire without making things worse. He was excited to attend. In part, he enjoys camping. In part, because he used to look for any reason to avoid his parents. Regretfully, things didn't go as planned from the beginning. It turned out that the campground reservation had been botched up by one of my dad's acquaintances. We arrived at this awful, overdeveloped campsite rather than a secluded, serene location deep in the woods. I'm referring to paved walkways, inside restrooms, and even a playground for young children. No camping was going on. I suppose it was a glorified kind of glamping or backyard living. It would be an understatement to say that my dad was upset. The worst portion wasn't even shown to us until a few hours later. There was a little amusement park right adjacent to the campsite. I'm serious. A real amusement park featuring many roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, and carnival games. It's unbelievable. It was never intended for the two settings to meet, a campground and an entertainment park. Everyone was furious. Charles wouldn't stop talking about how this wasn't true camping, and my dad and his friend complained about it as well. He insisted on reminding me that this isn't true camping. Charles kept making jokes about my family as though we were unaware of what true camping was, and it became annoying. Even though I detest camping, I now understand what it should look like. Charles's suggestion to the contrary was starting to irritate me. He did as I instructed and told him to stop. The entire circumstance was awful. We had spent hours driving to the location. We couldn't simply turn around and walk away. We therefore made the best of it, as there was no other choice. The adults pouted for a while before starting to set up the camp. Naturally, Charles took center stage as if it were his moment to shine. In just a few minutes, we had our tent set up, the rainfly safe, all the knots tied precisely, and everything staked and toted like it was straight out of a manual. Even my dad nodded in agreement, which annoyed me a little because he never truly complimented anyone unless they were bleeding or unconscious. I was sharing a tent with Charles, and after dinner was finished and everything was prepared, we took a brief break under the justification of organizing our belongings. In actuality, Charles had brought some marijuana in an old Altoids tin, along with a small metal pipe. Not much, just enough to ease the tension. It is important to note that Charles and I were in that deviant stage of life where we enjoyed stirring up problems and congregating in inappropriate places. I no longer use marijuana, but I will always question whether my attempt to stand out and flout social norms was the main reason I ever did. Regardless, the two of us crept into the forest and smoked while giggling amongst ourselves. Since we would most likely be spending the rest of the evening away from the adults, I don't think either of us was concerned about smelling. After our lesson was over, we headed back to the tent. We both decided that we had far too much energy to sleep after spending a few hours relaxing and chatting about some of our other school pals. Charles was grinning mischievously, and I could only speculate as to what he was thinking. I wasn't convinced when he proposed that we check out the campsite. That is, until I understood that he planned to explore the amusement park, which immediately caught my attention. Reaching the top of one of those roller coasters would likely be easy, he suggested. In those days, we liked climbing things, and the idea of riding a roller coaster was thrilling. We therefore took action once we were certain that everyone was asleep. At that point, it was way past midnight and quite late. After grabbing our flashlights, we made our way to the park's perimeter fence. Climbing wasn't even that difficult. Charles gave us a little boost, and we were in. Despite the darkness, security personnel were on patrol. We would occasionally hear the sound of a golf cart as it went by. We had the impression that we were skulking around and attempting to avoid detection in some sort of stealth video game. We moved cautiously around the park, hiding behind structures and watching the patrol. We had to run across a wide section of road at one point to get away from a guard. In fact, it was both extremely thrilling and terrifying. It's a difficult emotion to explain, even though it all appeared like a game. We both understood that getting caught would have serious repercussions. When we finally arrived at the roller coaster's base, it appeared much larger up close than it had from the campsite. Without hesitation, we saw the maintenance steps running up alongside the main ascent. As we ascended one step at a time while attempting to minimize noise, the metal rungs clanged lightly beneath our feet. A portion of the road lacked rails, which was truly rather frightful. When we eventually arrived at the summit, the vista was breathtaking. Below us, the whole park was visible. As you can see below, we only snapped one picture up there. Although we were being very careful not to draw attention to ourselves because we would be able to escape in time if someone spotted us from below, I wish we had taken more photos. We ultimately concluded that we had pushed our luck too far and made the decision to return. Once we reached the bottom, we began to stealthily return to our starting point through the park. The return path was significantly faster than the original one for some reason. Perhaps at that hour, the patrol wasn't as strict or something. I couldn't really tell you. When we had to stop, we were perhaps 5 minutes from where we had hopped the fence. We had to swiftly hide behind a snack kiosk and wait for the guards to pass, as one of them was driving a golf cart. At that moment, I saw movement in the shadows. I initially believed it might have been a hallucination or a shadow cast by the golf cart's headlights reflecting off an odd object. Charles, however, pointed in the same way after tapping my arm. I verified it by narrowing my eyes a little more. Another individual was around 30 feet away, barely visible in the shadows between two buildings. Like us, they were crouched down, as if they were skulking around and attempting to elude the guards. However, it didn't appear to be a child. The worst thing was that I was very sure they were staring right at us. In fact, we were a little afraid at this point. The scenario was becoming a bit stressful with the guards on patrol and now this. Despite our best efforts, we were unable to relocate. The guards had not yet passed. I continued to stare at the image, and they began to move. They rushed across the small spill of light from a nearby street lamp and across an area of open land. For a brief while, I could plainly see him. As I had suspected, it was a Mali. He had a very ungainly gait, as if he were hurt or disfigured, and was dressed in ragged attire. However, the dark liquid that was splattered across his face was more unnerving than anything else. It appeared to be blood. Charles also noticed it, and we exchanged a horrified glance. The man eventually ducked out of view. When the guard eventually moved past us, we maintained shifting. We returned to the barrier without exchanging words, persuaded that we were being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, but nobody was there. After returning to the fence, we scaled it in the same manner as before and descended on the opposite side. The distinction was that we didn't joke about it this time. I just wanted to return to the security of our tent. Charles was clearly thinking the same thing. Both of us had stopped sleeping by the time we returned to our tent. In our sleeping bags, we simply lay there, unable to interpret what we had witnessed. Our best guess was that it was a homeless man doing something he didn't know what to do. I realized this is a dumb explanation, but we were at a loss for ideas. The following morning got off to a typical start. After getting up and eating something, we began preparing our fishing equipment. However, one of the camp staff members approached our tent site at around 10 in the morning and made a statement that was meant to be heard by the entire campsite. It seems that a man was fatally stabbed at a lake approximately 4 miles from the campground the previous evening. The local sheriff's office had requested that all park rangers and campground employees within a specific mile radius be on high alert, and the perpetrator was still at large, although they were withholding many details. He was described as a disheveled white man in his late 30s, who was naked and might have been bleeding or had blood on his clothing. Then, for our own protection, they told us to get our belongings and depart. Charles and I were able to connect the dots right away. That guy we saw the previous evening must have been the one. We didn't say anything. My dad was not informed. We kept the rangers in the dark, and I'm still not really sure why. I understand that I'm going to receive a lot of criticism for this. However, I was more certain than anything else at that age to remain out of trouble. I still chastise myself for keeping quiet. A dangerous individual who might have committed other crimes might have been apprehended as a result of my statement. Charles and I are still very close. We attended the same university, received our degrees together, and have comparable careers. However, we don't discuss this experience very often. To be honest, I believe Charles feels a lot more remorse than I do for keeping quiet. Despite my regrets and mistakes, I find it absurd that my companion and I were only a few feet away from a fugitive killer. It bothers me to consider what might have happened if we had met that evening. This incident occurred in October 2016, at the height of the bizarre clown mania. Across the nation, people were reporting spooky clown sightings. As you are aware, there were a few real cases that were absolutely horrifying, but the majority were clearly frauds or people merely looking for publicity. One of them was what transpired with me. I was a junior in high school, 16 years old. I boarded the 6th train going uptown after bidding farewell to all of my buddies after finishing 7th period. Although somewhat odd, the train was largely empty, which is not unheard of. I wasn't paying much attention to my environment. With my headphones in, I was listening to loud music. Drake, most likely. To make things worse, I was as ignorant as possible because I was using my phone to review chemistry flashcards. Traveling alone is never a good idea, but I knew enough about the area to know that I would probably be alright. At 96, I intended to get off and go home. It's just another Wednesday, nothing out of the ordinary. But things quickly took a turn for the worse. When we got to 96th, I instantly leaped from my seat without even checking to make sure it was the correct station. I had taken the train so frequently that it had become second nature to me. Getting on and off was automatic. I moved toward the doors with my head still buried in my phone and my music still blaring in my ears. However, as soon as they slid open, I became aware that something was blocking my way from the corner of my eye. When I looked up, I saw that a man had walked straight into the doorway. However, it wasn't an ordinary individual. It was a clown. He had on the entire outfit: big red shoes, a loose yellow blouse with red suspenders, oversized rainbow pants, and this over-the-top white makeup applied to his face. Blue eyebrows, red nose, the complete cartoon horror. The wig was the only item missing. He literally stopped me cold when I saw him. I had never been that near to something so strange before, in addition to being totally taken by surprise. He said nothing at all. He simply stood there, obviously blocking my exit from the train, but not attempting to board it. I had to do something when I snapped out of my daze and realized I had only 5 seconds left before the doors would close. I attempted to brush by him, but as soon as I really touched him, he leaned down in a single, smooth motion, as if to confirm that we were looking each other in the face. I ran past him before he could grasp me or hold me. At that moment, he staggered forward, trying to hit me. He began pursuing me after I ducked under him and kept running. It was horrible. A murderous clown was pursuing me, and there was nobody else in the area. I was pretty much alone at the 96th Street station because it is not very busy in the early afternoon. I glanced over my shoulder and noticed that he was after me. His stride was the only abnormality. I was much more interested in what was in his hand than in the jerky motion he was making as he ran, as if his limbs were out of proportion. It appeared to be a kitchen knife. I was unaware of his plans or the location where he had been concealing them, but I didn't give a damn. I hurried out of the station, up the steps, and informed the police of the matter right away. Even though he didn't follow me out into the street, I was still somewhat worried. He had already left when the police sent someone down to the station. I could unshake the illogical suspicion that he somehow knew where I lived and would come after me later, even after speaking with the police and being told that I was secure. However, that clearly did not occur. Actually, nothing else ever took place. If my story were shown on the news as one of the several bizarre clown encounters of 2016, I wouldn't be shocked. I can't say for sure though. I needed several weeks to recover completely from this experience. Although this isn't your usual terrifying tale, I can assure you that it's worth hearing. The whole affair began when I was 2 years out of college. I still had a ton of free time even though I was formally pursuing an online graduate certificate. At the same university where I earned my bachelor's degree, I was hopping from odd job to odd job during that time in my life, in search of any old gig to help me accumulate some cash and fill the hours. Let's just say that at the moment, Indeed was my closest friend. To be honest, that one website alone provided me with 90% of my leads. I was sick of doing minimum wage door-to-door in the same 6 neighborhoods. I therefore concluded that a change of pace was necessary. Later that evening, I came across something interesting while perusing Indeed. At a hotel a few towns away, it was a private lifeguarding position. Even while that doesn't sound all that peculiar on its own, I was intrigued by a few odd elements in that listing. The hours were reversed. To start, for example, those weren't typical pool hours. A normal hotel pool should open in the morning and close in the evening, with perhaps a few hours of quiet in between. Isn't that right? This, however, was the reverse. Almost perfectly. During the week, they needed someone to run and watch over a swimming pool from 5 p.m. until 1 a.m. It was essentially a pool night shift. However, that wasn't the most peculiar thing. The specifications specifically called for someone who was non-Spanish speaking. Let me say it again. They expressly desired a non-Spanish speaker. This was the issue. Since I was a small child, I have spoken Spanish. Actually, I have half Mexican ancestry. Americans who spoke Spanish made up the majority of the community where the hotel was located. Therefore, I didn't think the criterion made any sense. Actually, I didn't understand anything about the listing. I recall searching through it and being really confused. However, there was one thing that made me feel really good. $30 per hour, which in the inflation-adjusted economy of today would likely be around $50. I am not sure if it is accurate, but the main idea is that $30 an hour was like stepping on a gold bar in those days. It is safe to say that I chose to concentrate on the compensation and ignored all the other bullshit. I decided to simply act as though I didn't speak Spanish. Were they going to do something? The fact that I received a response and was invited for an interview within a few hours suggests that the position was either brand new or extremely in demand. Let's go ahead to the first day. When I arrive at the hotel, everything appears to be just as you would have imagined. This overweight man, who seems Mexican, comes out to welcome me, and we laugh and share information. In actuality, he was rather amiable and humorous, and I felt a little more at ease because of his friendly manner. However, this other, taller guy turned a corner and began gazing down at me as we entered the complex. It was immediately apparent to me that I was being profiled, and I began to question if the individual who greeted me was using such a tactic to make me relax. The second guy approached me directly and began speaking Spanish with me. He didn't shake my hand, say hello, smile, or do anything else. I recognized what he was doing right away. The listing hadn't been nonsense, because he was attempting to determine my level of Spanish proficiency. Even though I understood everything he said, I just stared at him blankly. By the way, he wasn't saying anything out of the ordinary. He was simply talking incoherently about the weather. It wasn't significant enough to warrant recall. I turned to the first guy after a few seconds, and he turned to the taller one. Then, as though they had both heard a practical joke, they both started laughing. The taller man grinned, held out his hand, and claimed he was merely playing a practical joke on me. Although I felt a little uncomfortable, prima agreed to Italiano. He identified the larger man as Esteban and himself as Hef. The taller man, whom I believed was in charge, began explaining the task to me as the three of us made our way through the complex to the pool. He said that to boost income, they needed someone to work longer hours, and were planning to start charging non-guests to use the pool. Even though I had no idea if that was legal, I wasn't going to start griping, although I didn't entirely understand. I agreed when they said they needed someone who didn't speak Spanish because it would stop boisterous people from trying to bother me. My duties included the following. Naturally, lifeguards take money from non-guests, attempting to use the pool and contact Hef in the event of an issue. There was yet another item. Hef instructed me to let someone into the pool house, a large structure behind the lifeguard post, provided they presented me with a blue wristband. I made no inquiries. The first week was quite relaxed. Actually, the first several weeks. I had a lot more work ahead of me because a lot more people utilized the pool than I had anticipated. I watched and collected money from strangers. I was not shown a wristband. About a month later, I was shown a bracelet for the first time. This burly Hispanic man in shades and a white button-down shirt approached me one day at random, obviously not speaking a word of English. I opened the pool house when he showed me his wristband. An hour or so later, He came out and started to move in the direction of the departure gate. I didn't have to talk to him or get down again because the pool house door automatically latched, but I did watch him go. Other than the fact that his backpack appeared somewhat fuller than it had when he first arrived, everything was the same. In the weeks that followed, an increasing number of people began to show me their wristbands, and many of them began to arrive in groups, because I started making far more money than I had previously made. More and more non-guests also started using the pool. I realized that I was actually making too much money at one point. For example, individuals who joined the pool would regularly overcharge me by an absurd amount. When I called Hef about it, he assured me that mistakes were inevitable and that I shouldn't be concerned. He hung up the phone while I was in the middle of speaking, so I knew he didn't want to discuss it more than was necessary. That brief, innocuous phone call reassured me that I was engaged in something more than lifeguarding a swimming pool in the middle of everything fishy that was happening. I didn't realize how serious the situation was until I hung up the phone. Until I couldn't get a single notion out of my head. My mind began to stifle all the noise. Laundering of money. I had no idea what to do. On the one hand, my gut told me that I should leave right away since I was participating in something criminal. However, I didn't want to lose $30 an hour for nothing, and I didn't have a reliable method of verifying that suspicion. I therefore kept my mouth shut and continued working. But after that, I began to piece everything together. The shady activities obviously took place at the pool house, or the facility I was told was a pool house. Drug trafficking, illegal gambling, or worse. Whatever it was always taking place just behind me, hidden from view by a single shut door. The pool patrons, particularly those wearing wristbands, began to be friendlier with me. My name started to be known to strangers, and I started getting tips, high fives, and greetings in addition to money. As individuals gained greater, they began speaking in front of me after being at ease with me. Let's just say that all of my concerns were validated when I overheard bits of their Spanish language conversation. The extra advantages indeed made it much simpler to ignore everything else. In addition, my hands were clean. I was working for a company to complete a task, and I was doing just that. In relation to my work, a few days later, I had to save a child who was drowning. It was merely a child who went too far into the water and was obviously incapable of swimming. Nothing particularly heroic. However, I received a standing ovation from everyone when I surfaced back into the water. It was an incredibly unusual sensation. He then came down from wherever he had been in the hotel and gave me a special thank you for your excellent lifeguarding. I didn't get his claim that he owed me his life until I discovered the child I had rescued was, in fact, his son, Esteban, and several other men, some of whom I knew from wearing wristbands, were waiting at the entrance the following day to welcome me with a glass of wine. That felt fantastic, of course, but it was short-lived. One of the men made a toast in Spanish after everyone had toasted me. Although I can't recall every word that was uttered, it wasn't a nice speech. Whatever that meant, he was essentially toasting all the money they were earning and all the lives they were taking. Everyone drank and laughed, but it was at that point that I realized I had developed a very dangerous addiction. I shouldn't have stayed at that hotel for so long for any amount of money or tips. And unfortunately, my mother contacted me the following day while I was at the swimming pool. I won't get into it, but I had to answer when my mother, may she rest in peace, called unless it was an urgent matter. In order to enjoy some privacy, I left my stand and went to what I believed to be a little quiet cove. Since my mother could only speak Spanish, I had to converse with her in that language. I can't recall the reason she phoned. I do recall that Esteban was standing right in my path, staring at me as I hung up and turned to return to the pool. The amiable man I had met on my first day at the pool did not appear to be the same person. He inquired how long I had been learning Spanish after a really awkward silence. I pretended to be stupid and claimed that I was merely practicing with a friend in order to learn. But I knew he would see right through me. He simply continued to look at me as though he was thinking about something. My heart began to race, and I had the impression that he was considering hurting me. Finally, all he muttered was, "Okay." I instantly went back to my post after turning around. I considered getting out of the chair, but I was unable to do so. That could have been interpreted by them as an admission of guilt. I might have been failing an exam. They most likely knew my residence. All of those things were going through my head as I prayed for my life, as I was motionless in the chair. He approached me just before my work finished and said he would have a new chance for me the next day. so I should come an hour early. After giving me a few $100s in tips, he left and returned to the hotel. I never came back to the motel after I left that day. No, there was no happy ending to that circumstance. I was a neurotic mess for months following that, but I don't believe I was ever followed home. I was terrified of every van and dubious-looking car in my neighborhood. On several evenings, I would simply remain awake for hours, contemplating the circumstances. There are still aspects of it that I don't fully comprehend, even after all these years. It was clear that they were transporting drugs. Primera, un Hersten. However, I've never understood why they would need me at all. In my opinion, they needed a payroll employee who could pretend to be a naive worker in case the police ever visited them. Who knows? Who? Who knows? Despite how improbable it may appear to everyone listening, I still believe that I came very near to dying that day. However, judging by the way Staben was staring at me, he was only thinking about one thing.